The explosion that ripped through western Russia that afternoon did not begin with fire. It began with confusion. Before a single bunker ignited, before ammunition started cooking off in chain reactions, Russia's air defense network had already been pulled apart, missile by missile. What looked like a routine intercept turned into something far more dangerous, because the first threat that morning wasn't the real one. At 06:03 hours local time, 12 Ukrainian drones lifted off from a staging area in Sumy Oblast. Their objective sat 930 kilometers to the northeast, the 100th Growl Arsenal near Na. It was the deepest strike ever attempted against a Russian ammunition depot. But to reach it, something else had to happen first. At 0621, a Russian radar operator in Bryansk Blast noticed faint returns at the edge of his coverage. The contacts sharpened as they pushed east. He counted 12 signatures, maybe 13. Each return carried a radar cross-section consistent with a cruise missile. At 6 o'clock in the morning, that kind of signature gets attention fast. He flagged the tracks and pushed the data up the chain. 3 minutes later, the information appeared on the scope of a Buck M2 battery commander positioned 70 kilometers north. What he saw looked disciplined. 12 confirmed tracks moving northeast at 160 kilometers per hour. Altitude steady between 600 and 900 meters. Terrain following profiles. Spacing tight and deliberate. Radar returns suggested mass. 400 to 500 kilograms per object. Current range, 58 kilometers. At that speed, they would enter his 50-kilometer engagement envelope in roughly 4 minutes. And then the math turned ugly. His Buck carried 4 ready rounds on the rails. 4 missiles, 12 incoming contacts. Reload time, 6 to 8 minutes. At their current speed, the swarm would cross his position in approximately 4 minutes. He had 1 magazine to stop something that outnumbered his ammunition 3 to 1. He didn't know what he was looking at. They could be cruise missiles. They could be decoys. They could be a new Ukrainian system he'd never encountered. But they were headed deeper into Russia. And nobody builds a career by watching cruise missile-sized tracks fly past while asking questions. At 0627, he made the only call a competent commander could make. 2 missiles roared off the rails, accelerating to nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The fire control radar held lock on the lead contacts, feeding guidance corrections as the interceptors closed at nearly a kilometer per second. 38 seconds to intercept. The first warhead detonated at 0628, a flash over Bonsk. 12,000 steel fragments shredded what appeared to be an 9-kilogram plastic decoy. The radar return vanished. Successful intercept. He had no idea he had just spent enough money to buy a luxury apartment destroying something that cost less than a bicycle. At 0631, he launched again. 2 more missiles. 2 more detonations. 2 more contacts erased from the scope. 4 ready rounds expended in 4 minutes. The Buck was empty. The transloader vehicle pulled alongside immediately. Hydraulics whined as missile canisters shifted. Minimum reload time, 6 minutes. Meanwhile, the remaining 8 contacts would cross his position in 5. He reported up the chain. 100% hit rate. What he did not report, because he didn't know, was that he had just been played. At 0636, the 8 remaining tracks crossed his sector. 1 minute later, at 0637, a Tor M2 battery near Smolensk picked up the swarm. The Tor is Russia's short-range point defense system. 8 ready missiles. Engagement range up to 12 kilometers. Against real cruise missiles, it is dangerous, but these contacts were angling to pass 18 kilometers outside its envelope. The Tor commander studied the geometry, bearing 243, range 31 kilometers, moving north. He considered repositioning northwest to cut them off, but the wheeled chassis could only manage 40 kilometers per hour on those roads. By the time he moved, the targets would be gone. He tracked passively, reported what he saw. At 0638, 120 kilometers east of Smolensk, An S-300 battery began tracking the same 8 contacts. The S-300 is built for high-altitude threats, aircraft at 60,000 feet, ballistic missiles descending at speed. Its 4.8N6 missiles can reach 150 kilometers. Range was not the problem, altitude was. These objects were hugging the Earth at 800 meters, buried in terrain clutter. The fire control solution flickered on the commander's display. Lock. Lost. Lock. Degraded. He could launch on a partial solution and hope the missiles onboard Seeker acquired during intercept. But hit probability against a low-altitude cruise missile with degraded lock was maybe 40%. Each missile cost between $1, $2, and $2 million. An expensive gamble on bad odds. He requested guidance. By 0639, the Buck battery in Briansk had completed its reload. 4 fresh 9M31, 7 missiles ready. But now, the contacts were bearing 067 at 82 kilometers, moving away, a stern chase. At that range, his interceptors would burn most of their fuel catching up. Against a straight-line target, probability might be acceptable. Against anything maneuvering at the last second, far worse. He reported ready status. The geometry was garbage, and he knew it. By 0640, the Coordination Center saw the full picture. 1 Buck with missiles but poor geometry. 1 TOR that couldn't reach. 1 S-300 with unstable lock. 8 cruise missile-sized tracks threading deeper into Russia at 160 kilometers per hour. 12 missiles ready to fire, 0 clean shots. And every minute that passed carried those tracks too. 7 kilometers farther into the motherland. The decision would come next. And it would open a corridor no one on the Russian side realized existed. At 0641, the regional air defense duty officer made his choice. He had 2 options. First, order degraded engagements. The Buck in Briansk could attempt a stern chase. The S-300 could fire on partial lock. Total missiles required, somewhere between 8 and 16. Estimated cost, $6 to $12 million. Probability of eliminating all 8 contacts, low. Second option, scramble fighters. 2 Su-35s from Kino Air Base could intercept in approximately 20 minutes. Each aircraft carried 8 R-77 missiles, more than enough firepower to destroy 8 cruise missile-sized targets with margin to spare. But option 2 carried a hidden consequence. The moment those fighters entered the engagement zone, every surface-to-air missile battery across the sector would receive an automated weapons hold instruction. Standard doctrine. Prevent friendly fire. When manned aircraft operate in the engagement zone, ground-based systems go cold. The duty officer checked the clock. Every minute of hesitation meant another 2, 7 kilometers deeper into Russian territory. He ordered the scramble. Within 3 minutes, 2 Su-35 fighters were wheels up from Kino. Their engines drove them northeast at 500 kilometers per hour. During the climb, targeting data streamed into their cockpits. 8 cruise missile-sized contacts, bearing 047, range 280 kilometers, altitude 800 meters, speed 160 kilometers per hour, estimated intercept in 14 minutes. At 0649, the automated instruction propagated through the network. Weapons hold. All sectors. Friendly aircraft operating in engagement zone across Briansk, Smolensk, and Kuga Oblast. The effect was immediate. The Buck battery that had just reloaded lowered readiness status. The Tor near Smolensk stood down. The S-300 tracked passively but kept its fire control radar cold. For the next several minutes, the airspace belonged to the fighters. At 0658, the Su-35s made radar contact. They descended to engagement altitude and began prosecuting the swarm using their Urbis-E radars. The targets maintained steady course and speed. No evasive maneuvers. No countermeasures. No defensive behavior at all. At 0701, the first R-77 left its rail. The missile closed on its assigned contact and detonated at 0702. One track vanished. The pilots worked methodically. One missile per contact, one intercept after another. The targets never reacted. At 0713, the flight lead reported the engagement zone clear. 8 contacts destroyed. Threat neutralized. The Su-35s turned back toward Kino to rearm. Across western Russia, surface-to-air batteries powered their radars back up. Scope swept empty skies. The duty officer logged the engagement as a successful intercept of a Ukrainian cruise missile strike. On paper, the system had worked. But what the pilots had destroyed over Bryansk and Smolensk that morning were not cruise missiles. They were Hakai-20 Ukrainian decoys, each weighing just 9 kilograms. Constructed from plastic and foam. And inside each fuselage was a device that changed everything. A Luneburg lens. A Luneburg lens is a sphere built from concentric dielectric shells. Layers of material with precisely calibrated densities that bend radar waves in a specific way. Normally, when radar energy strikes an object, most of it scatters randomly. Only a small fraction returns to the receiver. A Luneburg lens does the opposite. It captures incoming radar waves and focuses them back toward the source, like a mirror. The result is dramatic. An 9-kilogram drone suddenly produces a radar return up to 15 times larger than its actual size. To the Buck's fire control radar, each Hakai-20 looked like a 400-kilogram cruise missile. To the Su-35's Urbis-E radar, it looked the same. Without visual confirmation, operators had no way to tell the difference. And by the time the fighters got close enough to see what they were shooting at, the engagement was already complete. The decoys had done exactly what they were designed to do. They triggered the Buck. They pulled in the Tor. They forced the S-300 to hesitate. They compelled the duty officer to scramble fighters. And most importantly, they forced the entire regional air defense network into weapons hold for nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes, where every ground-based system across Bryansk, Smolensk, and Kuga Oblast went cold. That was the real objective. Because 40 kilometers south of the engagement zone, flying at just 200 meters altitude, 9 A-196 Luty drones had been moving quietly through the corridor the fighters created. While Russian radars tracked fake cruise missiles at 800 meters, the real strike package stayed low, extremely low. 20 meters above ground in some segments, terrain-following systems keeping them just above the tree line. They'd already been airborne for 24 minutes when the Su-35s began firing, and they still had 740 kilometers to go. The weapons hold that opened the corridor behind them did not extend to batteries farther east. The air defenses ahead remained active. Over 800 kilometers of hostile airspace stood between them and the 100th Growl Arsenal near NA. The decoys had bought distance. Now the real test began, and the first cracks in the mission would appear long before they reached their target. The deception phase was over. Now the mission depended on endurance, navigation, and math. 9 A-196 Luty drones pushed northeast at low altitude, some segments as low as 20 meters above the terrain. Their terrain-following systems kept them just above the tree line, adjusting constantly to dips, ridges, and forest edges. Unlike previous long-range Ukrainian strikes, these drones were not relying on GPS, and that difference mattered. Earlier, Ukrainian operations had depended heavily on satellite navigation, but Russian electronic warfare units had grown extremely effective at degrading or spoofing GPS signals. A well-executed spoof could convince a drone it was 50 kilometers from its true position. That kind of deception could send an aircraft into empty forest, into a populated area, or even back toward friendly territory. The Luty drones were built to avoid that vulnerability. Their navigation system, called Sky Node, ignored satellites entirely. Instead, it used onboard cameras to compare live terrain imagery against high-resolution maps loaded before launch. It was a visual matching system. No signal to jam. No external data link to intercept. Just software comparing shapes to shapes at 160 kilometers per hour. It wasn't perfect. Seasonal changes could introduce errors. Snow cover altered terrain contrast. Rising water levels changed shorelines. New construction reshaped recognizable features. The system performed best in daylight or strong moonlight, which is why the mission had launched at dawn. But it was good enough. For a while, at 0847, one of the Luty drones encountered its first serious problem east of Tula. The terrain below did not match stored imagery. What should have been open farmland was now a half-frozen reservoir. Water levels had risen 3 meters since the imagery had been captured, altering the shoreline geometry that the navigation system used for positioning. The flight computer attempted reconciliation. It cross-referenced surrounding features, searching for landmarks it could confirm. 2 kilometers north, it identified a road junction that matched stored data. Course correction followed. But the delay, 47 seconds, pushed the drone approximately 800 meters off its planned route. That deviation placed it directly inside the detection envelope of a Tor battery guarding a rail junction outside Tula. The Tor crew had 8 seconds from detection to launch. They used 4. The intercept was successful. 8 drones remained. At 0903, another Luty encountered a different failure. Its Chinese-manufactured piston engine had been running at 85% throttle for nearly 3 hours. Internal temperatures began climbing past design limits. Fuel consumption increased by 12% as the engine struggled to maintain cruise speed. The calculation was unforgiving. At the current burn rate, the drone would exhaust its fuel approximately 40 kilometers short of the target. There was no adaptive solution available, no mid-mission refuel, no throttle profile change that would preserve both timing and range. It continued on course until 0947, when the engine seized over Nizhny Novgorod Oblast. The drone glided for 90 seconds before impacting an empty field. There was no explosion. Its 75-kilogram warhead required a valid target lock to arm. Without that condition met, it remained inert. 7 drones remained. At 10:31, a third Luty flew too close to a Pantsir battery escorting a military convoy. The commander faced a decision similar to the Buck commander hours earlier. An unidentified low-altitude contact, heading deeper into Russian territory. No weapons hold order applied in his sector. No friendly aircraft nearby. No reason not to engage. 2 missiles left the rails at 10:32. The first connected at 10:33. 6 drones remained. The Ukrainians had planned for 40% losses. They were now at 33% attrition, with 520 kilometers still to go. The margin was thin. The survivors adjusted course, avoiding the locations that had just revealed themselves. Mission planners had anticipated gaps between radar coverage zones. Weeks earlier, those gaps had been mapped and analyzed using the same Skynode terrain databases the drones carried on board. But even with preparation, 520 kilometers of hostile airspace remained. By 1423, 6 Luty drones crossed into Castro Wall. They were still flying at 20 meters altitude, still emitting no signals, still invisible to satellite-based jamming systems. 12 kilometers ahead lay the objective. The 100th Growl Arsenal near NA sprawled across 2 square kilometers of birch forest. Storage bunkers, warehouses, hard stands, rail sidings. At 1426, onboard cameras captured the target complex for the first time. The imagery was recorded and later transmitted via burst transmission to Ukrainian intelligence. What it showed confirmed the risk had been worth it. The facility was active. Trucks moved between bunkers. Forklifts loaded pallets. On a rail siding along the eastern ridge of the complex, 4 flat cars carried crated cargo that did not match anything in the Russian military inventory. The crates were too large for standard artillery shells. The shape was wrong for MLRS rockets. The markings were not Cyrillic. Whatever was stored there, it had not come from a Russian factory. At 1427, the Pantsir battery protecting the arsenal detected the first inbound contact. One track appeared at bearing 237, range 18 kilometers, low altitude, fast. Seconds later, a second contact appeared at bearing 194, then a third at 261. They were not flying in formation. They were converging from 3 different vectors. The Panzer operator had one system: twin 30mm autocannons, capable of firing 5,000 rounds per minute combined. Engagement range up to 4 kilometers. Against one inbound drone, the math is manageable. Against from 3 directions, the timing becomes critical. The guns can only point one way at a time. Slewing between targets takes 2 seconds. Achieving stable lock takes another 5 seconds. A burst sufficient for reliable destruction requires 3 seconds. Total engagement cycle, approximately 5 seconds per target. At 160 kilometers per hour, a drone covers nearly 290 meters in that time. The operator designated the closest contact, bearing 237, now 11 kilometers out. The engagement clock had started, and it was about to outrun him. At 4 kilometers, the Panzer's twin 30mm autocannons opened fire. The first Luty disintegrated in midair, composite fragments scattering across the southern perimeter of the 100th Growl Arsenal. One threat removed. But the clock was already working against the operator. He slewed to the second target at bearing 194. Radar searched, lock achieved, guns firing. At 14:29, the second drone went down. 2 kills in less than 2 minutes. But the third inbound contact was already inside 3 kilometers. And then the situation worsened. As the operator pivoted to engage the third drone, 3 additional contacts appeared on his scope, approaching from the north in loose formation, 8 kilometers out. This had been timed. While the Panzer was focused south and west, tracking, locking, firing, the remaining Luty drones had swung wide around the eastern perimeter of the facility. A forested ridgeline masked their approach. The radar had been busy with active engagements, which meant its scan priority had narrowed. By the time the operator cleared the third target and swept north, the second wave was already inside 8 kilometers and closing. He had 6 seconds to deal with the immediate threat. The guns found the third drone at 1 kilometers. The burst walked across its flight path. Fragments struck the fuselage. The drone staggered, but it did not break apart. Its 75-kilogram shaped charge warhead was already armed. At 14:30, the first Luty struck a storage bunker in the southern section of the complex. The shaped charge detonated on impact, punching through the reinforced concrete roof. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the artillery shell stored floor to ceiling inside the bunker began cooking off. The second impact followed 4 seconds later in the northern section, into a warehouse packed with crated rockets. The third drone hit a hard stand where trucks had been loading ammunition just 20 minutes earlier. The fourth Luty, the damaged one the Panzer had failed to destroy, dived into the rail siding along the eastern ridge, into the flat cars carrying crates marked in non-Cyrillic script. This detonation was different, brighter, hotter. And the secondary explosions began almost instantly. Ammunition across the facility ignited in sequence. Propellant burned. Warheads detonated inside storage crates. Shockwaves rolled outward through the birch forest. The sound reached NA, 3 kilometers away. It did not stop. What detonated inside those rail cars was not routine stock. Later analysis revealed why the explosion had been so violent. The crates with non-Cyrillic markings were Korean. Inside were KN-23 ballistic missiles, North Korea's answer to the Iskander. Weapons Russia could not manufacture domestically in sufficient numbers. Systems shipped roughly 6,000 kilometers across the Asian continent to a depot Moscow believed was beyond Ukraine's reach. They believed wrong. The 4 initial impacts triggered cascading secondary detonations across the 2-square-kilometer complex. Storage bunkers ruptured. Ammunition stacks ignited. Fuel sources accelerated the chain reaction. 6 Luty drones had entered the final attack phase. 4 reached critical targets. The mission planners had calculated 40% attrition as acceptable. They absorbed 33% losses before reaching the target, and the remaining drones delivered. What began at 06:03 with 12:08. 9-kilogram decoys had forced Russia to expend high-value interceptors, scramble fighters, and shut down its regional surface-to-air network under weapons hold. While operators tracked cruise missile-sized ghosts at 800 meters, the real strike package slipped through at 20 meters. The Luneburg lens deception worked. The corridor opened. The Skynode navigation system carried the drones through GPS denial zones. And the final approach exploited timing, geometry, and the engagement cycle limits of a single Pantsir battery. The Buck commander believed he had destroyed cruise missiles. The Su-35 pilots believed they had cleared the sky. The duty officer logged a successful intercept. But the 100th Growl Arsenal burned. What had been stored there? Artillery shells, rockets, and KN-23 ballistic missiles was no longer operational. The explosion was not random. It was engineered. From radar physics to engagement envelopes to reload times, every step forced a decision, and each decision shaped the next vulnerability. This strike was not about a single depot. It demonstrated that decoys weighing under 9 kilograms could manipulate a layered air defense system designed to counter high-altitude aircraft and ballistic threats. It proved that surface-to-air doctrine could be turned into a liability under coordinated deception, and it exposed how coverage gaps timed correctly could open corridors hundreds of kilometers long. The first threat that morning was never the real one. The real threat flew low, and by the time Russia realized it, the arsenal was already exploding.